You are now tuned into the truth frequency.
We are TFR. TFR.
Truth Frequency Radio.
You're listening to the Revolutionary Radio Project with your host, Rob Skiba.
All I'm offering is the truth.
Hello and welcome to the Revolutionary Radio Project. I am your host, Rob Skiba, and this evening I'm bringing Zen Garcia back on the program. We're going to pick up where we left off, more or less. Last week, we had a lot of interesting conversations last week, and a whole bunch of people were commenting that they were really interested in what was being said. And we were really just kind of talking about the Thracian Chronicles and the testimony of Longinus, the soldier who pierced Christ's side. In the Bible, he's not named, he's just called the centurion, but his name shows up in documents like the Gospel of Nicodemus and other documents. And I don't know if you knew this, Zen, but there's actually a ritual that takes place, and I forget the name of it, and I forget where it is. I'd have to look it up again. But back in the 90s, when I did a ton of research on this guy, as basically the immortal soldier, the legend has it, I want to say it's like in Malta or somewhere in that area, people still celebrate the martyrdom of Longinus, where they sort of do a reenactment. He was apparently, historically speaking, he was beheaded, and they do a whole reenactment sort of his life. Were you aware of that?
No, I do know that he is celebrated and honored in different places by different people because of his sainthood, but no, I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah, I'll see if maybe I can pull it up while you're talking. But there were several topics that we just sort of grazed the surface of last week, and there were several times where you're like, I want to come back to that, and then we never had time to get back to it. So I'm basically going to more or less turn this over to you. The things that you felt like you wanted to share last week that you didn't have time to. And of course, I'm sure that'll spin off into all kinds of other conversation, but we just sort of pick up where we left off, and anything you felt like you wanted to share didn't have time to last week, go ahead and jump on it now.
Okay, sure. One of the things that I wanted to definitely bring up and mention in this show, because I know it was something that we had talked about and I never got to share the passage, and we were speaking about preexistence and about how the Most High and Yeshua even, he says that, some were predestinated before the foundations of the world, and how he knew us even before the foundations of the world. And in my opinion, in studying that and looking at election and how Jacob was favored and Esau hated even before they had been born as children, and then could elicit such favoritism or such hatred, that it has to be connected to something which, in my opinion, took place and had to do with our spiritual embodiments prior to entering into flesh form. Is the only way that it makes sense to me, because how else otherwise would it make any kind of sense that a righteous, just, loving, and caring, compassionate God would hate a child that had not yet been born? There has to be reason. There's always a reason why as to the things with regard to election. And so in studying about preexistence, I wrote my 6th and my 7th book, Sons of God and Skyfall, The Angels of Destiny, about this particular topic and exploring it. And in my opinion, like Ephesians 1, where it speaks about us being predestinated and the elect, and also where the word of the Lord goes to Jeremiah and tells him that I knew you before you ever entered into the womb of your mother, I had foreordained you to be a prophet unto the nations, that these kind of things, in my opinion, apply to all of us. And in studying about pre-existence from the extra biblical texts and also some of the commentaries of the ancient manuscripts which make commentary on pre-existence, it becomes clear, in my opinion, that that is what is being spoken about, that not that we are cycling through lifetime and embodiment and that we're being born over and over, because Hebrew 9:27 makes it clear that we are born into the flesh for one lifetime and then judgment, and the consequences of our behaviors and our actions and the choices that we make while in the flesh, um, there's retribution for all those things. And so I found this particular passage in the Chronicles of Jeremiah, which is one of my favorite extra-biblical manuscripts, and it goes from, it's a parallel commentary of the Bible, gives extra detail and description on all the um, different stories, beginning with Genesis, going all the way through the Pentateuch and other aspects of the Old Testament prophets. But in this particular text, it says in portion 9 on the formation of the child, I will now proceed to explain the formation of the fetus which God created when man approaches his wife. God indicates it to the angel appointed over conception, whose name is Layla. God says, know that this night a woman will conceive. Take the sperm, place it in thy hand, and break it on the threshing floor into 365 particles. He does so. He then takes the sperm in his hand, brings it to God, and says, O Lord of the world, I have done as thou hast commanded me, and now decree what is to become of it. God then decrees that it will be either strong or weak, male or female, rich or poor, beautiful or ugly, long or short, wicked or righteous. God then makes a sign to the angel appointed over spirits and says, bring me a certain spirit which is hidden in the Garden of Eden, whose name is so-and-so, and whose form is so-and-so. This applies to all the spirits which are destined to be created. For from the very moment when the world was created, all these spirits were prepared for men. As it is said, what has already been has been called by thy name. The angel brings the said spirit, which when it comes before God bows down and prostrates itself before him. At that moment God says to the spirit, enter thou this sperm. The spirit then opens its mouth and says, O Lord of the universe, I am satisfied with the world in which I have lived from the day on which thou didst create me. If it pleases thee, do not suffer me to enter this impure being, for I am holy and pure. God replies, the world which I caused thee to enter is better than the world in which thou hast lived. And when I created thee only for this purpose. God then causes it to enter this new being against its will. The angel then returns and causes it to enter the womb of its mother. Two angels are prepared to watch the embryo during its pregnancy. A light shines upon the head of the child, by which it sees from one end of the world to the other. In the morning the angel takes it into the Garden of Eden and shows it the righteous men who sit there in glory with crowns on their heads. The angel then says to the soul, my child, dost thou know who these are? No, it replies. The angel then says, these people whom thou seest here were formed like thee in the womb of their mother. They went forth into the world and observed God's statutes. Therefore they became worthy of this bliss. Know also that thou wilt at the end of thy days depart from the world, and if thou wilt be thought worthy to hearken unto the law and the commandments, then thou wilt be likewise worthy of sitting with these in the place where I showed thee. In the evening he carries it into Gehenna and shows it the sinners whom the wicked angels beat with fiery staves. They cry, woe, woe, but no mercy is shown them. The angel then says to the soul, dost thou know, my child, who these are that burn? No, it replies. The angel answers, These were of the same mean origin as thou art. They went forth to the world and did not observe the commandments and judgments of God. Therefore they have come to this place of punishment. Know also, child, that thou must ultimately quit this world. The angel walks about with it from morning until evening and shows it every place which it is destined to tread, and the place where it will be buried. After this he shows it the world of the good and the world of the wicked, and in the evening he places it back again in the womb of its mother. God then encloses it within folded doors, that is said, and he shut up the sea with doors until it burst forth from the womb and became free. It is further said, I will lay my words in thy mouth, and I will protect thee in the shadow of my hand. God then said, thus far thou shalt thou go, and no further, and he sustains the child in the womb of its mother for 9 months. At the end of that time the same angel comes and says to it, come forth, for the time has come for thee to go forth into the world. It replies, have I not already told God that I am satisfied to remain in the place where I was accustomed to dwell? And he replied, the place I will cause thee to enter is better than the world from which thou hast come. Now that it pleases me to remain here, why dost thou wish to remove me hence? The angel replies, thou must know that thou wast formed in the womb of thy mother against thy will, and now know that against thy will thou wilt be born and will come forth into the world. He then immediately strikes it, extinguishes its light, and brings it forth against its will. It then forgets whatever it had seen, and as soon as it comes forth into the world, it cries. And why does it cry? Because of the world it has left behind. For at that moment 7 new worlds are awaiting it. In the first world it is like unto a king after whose welfare all people ask. All desire to see it, embrace it, and kiss it, because it is in the first year. In the second world it is like unto a swine which wallows in mire. A child does the same until it reaches 2 years. In the third world it is like unto a kid that skips and gambols about on the meadows. Thus a child skips about here and there until it is 5 years of age. In the fourth world it is like unto a horse which strides along haughtily. In the same way does a child walk along proud in its youth until it's 18 years old. In the fifth world he is like unto an ass, upon whose shoulders burdens are placed. In the same manner burdens are heaped upon man's shoulders. He is given a wife by whom he begets children. He must wander to and fro in order to obtain food for them, and he is about 40 years old. In the sixth stage he is like unto a dog, insolent, wandering about in all places for food, stealing and robbing in one place, and enjoying it in another. In the seventh stage he is like unto an ape whose appearance is changed in every aspect. All the household curse him and desire his death. Even the young children make fun of him, and even the smallest bird wakes him from his sleep. Finally the time arrives for him to quit this world. When that time arrives, the same angel comes um, beside him and says to him, what is thy name? To which he replies, so and so, and why dost thou come to me to this day? To take thee away from this world. When he hears this, he weeps, and his voice reaches from one end of the world to the other. But no creature hears his voice except the cock. Have I not already told thee, he says, not to bring me forth from the world in which I have lived? But the angel replies, have I not already told thee that against thy will thou wast created, against thy will thou wast born, against thy will thou livest, and against thy will thou shalt die. Also against thy will thou art bound to render account and reckoning before him who said, and the world was made. So these are, this passage just kind of goes through the whole story of the soul before it enters into the flesh, and then talks about, the cycles, the steps of life as it goes through from being a young child until the end of death when it comes forth, and then the judgment, just as it says in Hebrews 9:27, and that really the whole purpose for us being here in the flesh is to know our Savior Messiah, and to assure through him salvation and eternity, and that's the whole reason, rather than a lot of the things with regard to the carnal aspects of life. Bringing forth children, getting a good job, making money, and having a bunch of stuff to pass on, namesake, legacy, that kind of stuff. And so
So what was the title of the book you were reading?
it's the Chronicles of Jeremiah. It's the formation of the child.
When
And
was that written?
it talks about who. It says, this is Moses Gaster's translation of the Chronicles of Jeremiah. The book is a collection of extended biblical events mixed with Roman histories, lists of geographical names, and patriarchal genealogies. Let me see.
Some of that sounded a little familiar. I'm trying to think.
It was published in 1899, but it goes back a long ways.
It's
I don't
in
know
the
when
same
that
type
guy
of
actually.
collection as like Gospel of Barnabas.
The Legends of the Jews, the commentaries that way. Which those are really old though. Those go back to the first century, but.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, it sounded like, everything was against the person's will.
Right.
Like they were, if I understood what you said, and if I retained what you said, reading from that there's a sort of a pool of nefesh, human spirits, I guess, in the Garden
like
of
the
Eden,
gut,
and when a person is at conception, God says, "Okay, grab a nefesh from the garden and put it in there." Is that
right.
and it's against that spirit's will, and then by the time they get into flesh and are born, they pretty much forget everything, and the last thing is,
Right.
they cry because they have forgotten, and it's all new, and where am I? What's going on? How do you vet any of that? How do you, it's like, what do you do with it except say, well, this is just what somebody else believed.
Well, and there are other stories too, like even though, as far as the spirit and some that may not have wanted to enter into flesh and that were, forced to come into the incarnation and being, but there are other stories that also talk about how that we have some say in, the choices and entering into flesh and taking on form, and that it's an agreement. And so there's different, accounts and different ways of looking at it. But the whole point to me, and even with the, scriptures of, again, Christ knowing us before the foundations of the world, is that, in my opinion, we pre-existed before coming into our flesh bodies, and that our spirits are separate from what are our physical flesh incarnations, and that we weren't just created when our parents copulated and the seed and the egg joined together and then started to spirits, again, go back to the very beginnings. And I believe that all the spirits of humanity and the angels and all of creation, that everything, the nefesh for the entirety of the world was created on the first day. That it speaks about this in Jubilees, that all the spirits of even the winds and all the different elements and the angels and all of that was created on the first day. And then that was what, became the animate, the consciousness, as far as consciousness now, especially in humanity. But
So last time when we were talking about this, we were discussing the idea that there may have been some sort of, when the rebellion in heaven took place, that spirits that were not angels, they were the nefesh that became human, may have chosen sides and based on the sides that they have chosen, or maybe either way, I guess, they are given an opportunity to find redemption through this life. And we're not talking about reincarnation.
No, not at all. Right.
It's all fascinating stuff. I don't know that, there's really a biblical precedent that we could cling to, or any way to vet any of this information, but it's interesting to think about.
Yeah, I agree. And then again, it remains a vague concept just within the biblical text, even though the Bible in a couple places does speak about election, but it doesn't comment greatly on pre-existence other than giving, a few examples here and there. Like, I had mentioned Ephesians 1, and I do believe that, Ephesians 1 also speaks about this as well. Like verse 4, he says, Paul, according as he hath chosen us in him before the foundation of the world, that we should be holy and without blame before him in love, having predestinated us unto the adoption of children by Jesus Christ to himself, according to the good pleasure of his will, to the praise of the glory of his grace, wherein he hath made us accepted in the beloved. It also mentions just a little bit lower down the same thing, about us being predestinated, and that, like here, in whom also we have obtained an inheritance, being predestinated according to the purpose of him who worketh all things after the counsel of his own will. Christ also speaks about how the Father had given him, his sheep before the foundations of the world. And in my opinion, again, looking at these things, how is it that he could have known us before the foundations of the world if we did not yet exist?
Well, unless there's God sees all of time.
Right. Yeah, I fully agree.
At once. Actually, predestination, that's one of those, do we have free will, or is everything predestined? Are we puppets on strings that don't, these are questions that people have wrestled with since the concept was even thought of. But my dad gave me the best explanation that I've ever heard anyway to help me understand it. We were sitting in the living room of my parents' house, and if you're in my parents' living room, you could go, there's a front door that would lead you outside, that's accessible in the living room. And then when you walk out of the living room, you have a choice. You could go left, that takes you down a hallway where there's 3 bedrooms and a bathroom, or you could go straight into the kitchen and take a right into the dining room where there's a door to the front driveway and a door to the backyard. And he said, when they built this house, there was a blueprint, and every direction was predestined. What's your choice?
Uh-huh.
So
right.
It's like, you can choose to go anywhere you want within the blueprint, but whatever choice you make, it is predestined to take you to 3 bedrooms and a bathroom, or the backyard, or whatever.
Right. Yeah.
And I'm going, okay, Dad, that really works for me. I can hold on to that. That's,
Yeah, because even though, as far as predestination, there's still free will, as far as the whole part of the whole paradigm, and that we all have free will. I don't think everything was already foreordained, and that God randomly decided, some are going to be favored and some are going to be hated, and these people are destined to damnation. Oh yeah, totally would be cruel. How in any manner can that, be? Why would a just God just randomly choose that these are going to be counted with the elect and these are going to be counted with the damned? That just, there has to be a free will component.
Because love requires.
Yes, absolutely. He wants
choice.
us to choose him. Yes. Yeah, I fully agree. And so, even though I do support predestination as it's taught by the text, there is yet still a free will component to all that. And with regard to, especially with our being, I believe at the end of days, that we are seeing now people that are from all the groups, those that are favored, those that are counted and numbered amongst the elect, and we see even the Illuminati families, those that are wicked and that are pushing the whole New World Order and that are advancing the agenda as far as the slaughter of innocents and the
Mhm.
poisoning of the food and water and those kind of things that the wicked are certainly being born. I mean, just even with, the children nowadays, just the
Yeah,
no sanctity of life.
hold that
Okay.
thought.
Yeah.
We're going to break, and we'll come back and pick up where we left off.
All right. Sounds good.
And we're back on the Revolutionary Radio Project. I am your host, Rob Skiba, and my guest this evening is Zen Garcia. We're picking up where we left off in the previous broadcast here on TFR. And right before the break, we were discussing issues of predestination and all that. Pretty heavy stuff, actually, when you kind of really get down to it. And you were talking about, just as we're going to break, we kind of cut off because of the break, but did you want to finish your thought?
Well, yeah, I was just saying as far as the free will component and how there has to be a free will component, even though, some people like Calvin, they speak about the predestination that we don't have a choice, that, our lives are already determined from birth until death, and that those that are going to be part of the elect, God has already chosen them, and that those that are going to be condemned, God has already chosen them. And in my mind, that just, it can't just be random. There's got to be a free will component. We have to have choice in the matter. And again, that's the reason why I think that our spiritual and the war in heaven and connections to it, that is what determined even Jacob and Esau being favored and hated. That there's some aspect to our previous spiritual embodiment, and the war in heaven, the temptation of 1/3 of the angels that fell and became legion, and then those that didn't, which is the majority. And in my opinion, that is from where most of humanity comes from, as far as being given a second chance, and that again, also in my opinion, I believe that that is the original sin, and that it's not just, we can't blame all of our coming into flesh and being born into flesh and taking on mortal embodiment on Adam and Eve and their eating fruit, even though that was what caused, it was from one man that death entered into the world, and that it was that sin certainly that caused the fall of humanity, and then it would be all of the descendants of Adam, and in my opinion also the serpent, which that's something else that I was going to bring forth from the last chapter of the Thracian Chronicles, as something that has been hidden and which was excluded from a lot of the other ancient texts, but it makes mention of that and the enmity between the seed lines and that whole war that I call the Great Contest. But anyways, and so that's what we see playing out even now with the parable of the tares of the field, the kingdom and the sower, is that we have this war between these two bloodlines ongoing even in this day and age, and that even the New World Order against humanity, that all has part to play with the ancient prophecy that was brought forth way back, that began in Genesis 3, where we have God speaking to the serpent and saying that I'm going to put enmity between thy seed and her, Eve's, the woman's seed, um, and it will smite your head at the same time that you're nipping at its heel. And that this war has been ongoing between these two bloodlines, playing out um, all throughout history and continues even in this day and age. Um, but if you'd like to comment on that, then I can share what I was talking about from the the last chapter of the book of Adam and Eve because it speaks about this specifically.
Yeah, go ahead. Just jump right in.
Okay. All right. In the last chapter, because when we were talking about as far as the Thracian Chronicles previously in the last show, which a lot of people really enjoyed and have been blessed by all of the teachings that we brought forth from that, especially showing and affirming that the Bible and the biblical narrative and our faith and the stories of the core tenets of our faith are not dependent on, nor were they plagiarized from the pagan Sumerian mythologies, but actually that, the Thracians being Christians, not only did they honor a Trinity and know that Yeshua would be born of a virgin of the line of Judah and of the King David's line, all of that, and that he would be the sacrificial lamb, all that being passed down through their oral and also their written traditions. But it that because right now everybody believes that even the stories of Noah's flood are based upon the Gilgamesh stories and the flood stories of Sumerian mythology, which um, all of that is pagan and written by and passed down from the different priests that were servants unto the Anunnaki and what the Nagamati call the archons and what we know to be the fallen angels and the fallen watchers. But in this particular text, the Thracian Chronicles, the ancient story, which I believe it to be the most ancient, it speaks about the marriage of Adam and Eve, which is always the last story of like the first book of Adam and Eve, the chapter, I think it's 78, it speaks about how the devil was tempting Adam and filling him with lust to marry Eve. And so God took that lust and made it holy. He, married them in matrimony and holy unification, and that was how the whole marriage institution came into being. But and so Satan was trying to get Adam to fall again, and in my opinion, it was trying to repeat the act which I believe had occurred in paradise, which led to Eve being impregnated with Cain, and that what we see in the Genesis 3 narrative with the punishments being delved out in Genesis 3:15 and 3:16 and onward, that those were actual prophecies, and that because of the temptation and the beguilement of Eve, that God saw that she was pregnant, she would give birth to Cain, and also because Adam repeated the act with her, eating of the fruit also, that the result of that was Eve would also give birth to his firstborn son, which was Abel. And then that's why we see, the punishments against the serpent. God tells him that I'm going to put enmity between thy seed and her seed, seeing and knowing that, Cain and Abel would be born as a result of this beguilement and being cast out of paradise, that it would be here upon the earth that these prophecies were fulfilled and that they would come to bear. And so here in this last chapter of the Thracian Chronicles, it repeats the story, kind of revisiting as Christ did in Matthew 13, where he tells the parable of the kingdom. He tells the story of the enemy that snuck into the garden and that sowed the tares. And he says that the wicked one is the father of the tares, and he is the devil. And that the war would end at the end of days when he returns to separate the harvest and sends forth the angels as reapers. But I'll read this portion and then it'll lead into what I'm talking about. It says, then Atum and Ua started to fasten and to pray till the end of the 40th day, and then they united as the angels told them, because God revealed the secrecy of the holy unification. And from the time when Atum left the Garden of Eden till the time of his marriage to Ua, had passed 223 days, which is 7 months and 13 days. Adam obeyed the angels and took the gold and put it into Eve's bosom in her garment and promised to marry her with his hand. Then the angels commanded Adam and Eve to get up and pray 40 days and 40 nights. When that was done, then Adam was to have sexual intercourse with his wife. For then this would be an act pure and undefiled, so that he would have children who would multiply and replenish the face of the earth. Then both Adam and Eve received the words of the angels, and the angels departed from them. Then Adam and Eve began to fast. Adam and Noah had children, and their children had their own children, and so they multiplied on the earth. But Satan's war against Adam and his descendants continued, and Satan's attempt to make Adam listen to him did not cease, because his intention was to destroy Adam by making him disobey God. And some of Adam's descendants did not obey God and listened to Satan's voice instead of listening to God. They became murderers of humans, as it was Adam's son called Cain, who killed his own brother Nabal. And they sow lies, are murderers, and malice on the face of the earth. And because they listened to the snake's voice, they also became children of the snake. And soon they began to act like reckless animals. And God remorsed that he had created them, because everything they did was evil. But soon God created a new race from the righteous son of Adam, Sebet, which a lot of the Thracian kings, they named themselves after this. It's spelled S-E-V-T, but of course we know that to be the
Seth.
Seth, yes. He did it because he listened to God's voice and resisted Satan and his deceit. This new race God called God's sons and daughters. And the descendants of the children of the snake began to fight the descendants of the children of God, so they might destroy them from the face of the earth forever, a war which continues even today. But God didn't forget his children. He will come to fulfill his promises and to save them forever when he again opens the gate to God's paradise, namely the place where God himself dwells. There resides eternal justice and eternal life. But to the children of the snake, he opened the gate to a place of eternal torment, namely to the place where the ancient snake, Satan, and his descendants, whom also lie and murder, also dwell. There is eternal lament and gnashing of teeth there, and to this day there remain two races of human beings which have nothing in common, despite looking physically the same, because they resemble the forefather Adam and foremother Ua. Their spiritual essence is completely dissimilar and incompatible. For in one race resides God's spirit, and in the other race resides the spirit of Satan. That's why strife exists between these two races, and there is no peace. And that's why conflict continues between them even today. And that's how it ends. But in all the other stories of the history and the life of Adam and Eve included. And
Well, yeah, I see people already kind of flipping out in the chat room regarding the serpent issue. It is one of those things that certainly starts a flame war pretty quickly.
yeah.
But
Yeah,
look, I understand the Genesis 4:1 argument because I've used it myself.
Mm-hmm.
But you have to go back to Genesis 3, and
Right.
I mean, it clearly says that there will be a war, enmity, between the offspring of the woman and the offspring of the serpent.
Right.
And so when people look at the offspring of the woman, they automatically go to Messiah. They say, okay, this is a prophetic statement referring to the Messiah. And yet we know that the Messiah has a genetic lineage, a heritage that goes all the way back to Adam and Eve.
Right.
Through people, successive generations, all the way till you get to Mary, and then he's born. So how can you then accept, if Messiah is the prophesied seed of the woman in Genesis 3:15, and we know that there is a genetic heritage from Adam and Eve to Yeshua, how can you just discount the same thing for what you would typically associate the Antichrist?
Exactly.
And that's where I got tripped up. I'm going, I mean, to be honest with you, I mean, we've done shows on this before. I've avoided the serpent seed thing like
You're
the plague.
probably wise to do so.
I mean, I get attacked for enough things as it is. Like I need one
right.
more thing for people to, lynch me for.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, it is something that when you look, and I only recently, like around the time when I had you and Dante Fortson on to debate it,
Right.
that was the first time in my life that I really intentionally sat down and said, yeah, I'm going to actually look into this. And whether I believe it or not, or anybody else believes it or not, the fact of the matter is it's all over the ancient literature, especially the Hebrews. As soon as I started looking into ancient Hebrew literature, the writings of the rabbis and commentaries on Torah, and it's all over the place.
Right.
Like they all believed it. So I go, well, I mean, right up through the second, third century, they were writing about it pretty prolific. There's a lot of writing on it. So, clearly they understood something. I mean, it seemed to be the prevalent view, and Genesis 4:1 doesn't trump all that.
Right. No, especially when you understand.
With the Targum.
Yeah, exactly. The Targum. When you go back to the Aramaic Targum, which are the oldest translations of the Hebrew Torah, they clearly state and clarify without a doubt that this understanding was, a part of the revelation of that, which is why when you understand that the serpent was the father of Cain, as it says in 1 John chapter 3, Cain, who was of that wicked one, that word of there being ekinos means son or progeny or descendant of, offspring of, then it becomes clear that that's why that passage is found at the beginning of Genesis 4, where we have the 10 generations of Cain listed and compiled in separation from Adam's genealogy, which is found in Genesis 5.
Yeah, and in that where it talks about Enoch 7th from Adam, you're like, well, if Cain was of Adam, then Enoch would be 8th from Adam.
Right.
Wouldn't be 7th from Adam.
Right.
Like, so right away, so many people were programmed, King James, that's it, King James.
Yeah, right.
And so you ring that, and, I was there, I'm like, okay, well, I mean, Genesis 4:1, done, I don't need to go any further. But, Genesis 3 and Genesis 5 really do seem to point blank contradict the understanding that we have from King James of Genesis 4:1. And then, like you said, Targum, it's a word we don't typically think about, if you're not a Jew. It just means translation. So King James version is a Targum. Targum just means translation. So it's an English translation. It's an English Targum. So the Aramaic being the earliest translation, I would say after the Septuagint.
Well, it's actually before.
Was it?
Yeah, because it dates back to the rebuilding of the temple, which occurred 70 years after the diaspora, which began in 587 BC. And so they returned to the land in 517 BC. It took 40 years to rebuild the temple. And so it was sometime in the 4th century, 100 years or so before the Greek Septuagint came in place, that the Targum were created, because they assimilated Aramaic during that time. But when the temple was rebuilt and worship reinstituted, they kept having to translate the Hebrew Torah into Aramaic. And so that's when the authorized Aramaic Targum translation came into being for those purposes. And so, they actually predate the Greek.
Because Septuagint was something like 200.
3rd century, third, 2nd century, somewhere around there.
Which, it's interesting because people give me a hard time about looking into, same as you, looking into extra biblical texts. And I'm like, look, there was no such thing as a Bible at the time. What there was a library of scrolls. You could walk into the library and they had all these scrolls in there. And among those scrolls were other texts that are not currently in our canon that clearly the authors of Scripture were very familiar, Enoch being the most dominant one, I would say. And it's easy to see now, post-Christ, why the Jews decided, let's pretend that was never in our library, because it's very pro Son of Man Messiah.
Yes.
And after Yeshua, I could see them go, whoa, we got to stay away from the book of Enoch because, it really supports this whole Messiah thing. And speaking of that, we were talking in the last show how the book of Adam and Eve and actually a fair amount of the same time period literature talks about a 5,500-year prophecy to the time of Messiah. I was thinking about this in the shower this morning. I was going, it's interesting that the people in the first century firmly believed that Messiah was coming back as in Armageddon in their time.
Uh-huh.
And so I'm thinking, if they believed in a 6,000-year timeline, they may have been almost, because like Adam and Eve and some of these other ones, at least like in the Lost Books of the Bible edition that includes it, has like a preface in it and talks about, I think it was 200 AD or something is when it's, I forget, but it was post-Christ that it was written as a Christian piece of literature.
Right.
That they may have been trying to force the numbers to bring about the end times closer to their time.
Their time, right? Yeah.
Like if they are the, I mean, you look at even the New Testament writers, they seem to have been of the mindset that any day now Christ is going to return. Until you get to like Peter, 2 Peter, first or second, I forget, but where he's like, look, God is not slack concerning his promise, as some men count slackness, but and he's almost saying, like, in the last days, many people will come saying, where's the promise? Because everybody's dying off. Right. You guys have been saying it for the last 40 years. He ain't come back yet.
Right.
That they had this feeling, understanding, Paul, even, these guys are like, yeah, we're there. It's the end times.
Yes.
And yet Christ didn't come back and wipe out everybody and set up shop and as a king and New Jerusalem coming down and all that did not happen. That maybe if they were of the mindset of a 6,000-year timeline with the 7,000th year being a millennial reign, that maybe they were kind of fudging the numbers for 5,500.
Mm-hmm.
I'm speculating.
Yeah. Well, it seems like a lot of the prophets and a lot of the people try to, fit the end times towards their lifetime, and that certainly everybody being alive, they think they see signs of the coming of the end, during their lives and interpret it that way. So yeah, I can see how people could have wanted to skew it in order to share the gospel and also to encourage people to, be perpetually, imminently ready for that return.
It is true that the way that it is written, you have to know that like at 1000 AD, there had to have been people thinking, this is it.
Right.
Just like there was at 2000 AD. And, of course, everybody's got their timeline charts and everything based on 1948 now. And, this year, right, May 14th, this was the 70th anniversary.
70th anniversary, right.
Of course, he didn't come back. And so they're going to reset for Psalm 90, verse 10. Must be 80th by strength.
80,
so
right, yeah.
Everybody will be, watching 2028. And, oh, by the way, Nibiru is supposed to come in 2022. So, that's about right, the timing for the 7-year tribulation.
Mm-hmm.
The whole thing. I used to be on the Planet X Nibiru bandwagon.
Right, yeah.
And there's a lot of compelling, interesting stuff. But actually, now that I've got onto biblical cosmology, I see the absurdity of all that. And when you realize that the vast majority of that whole mindset goes back to Zecharia Sitchin.
Absolutely.
And when you realize how full of crap he was, you eventually go, I think I would throw that out. And, now you got like Neil deGrasse Tyson, who he regularly says that he can't accept that there is a God because if you just look at space, there's too many things in quote unquote creation, according to his cosmology, that's trying to kill us, that how could I believe in a God like that that's going to put us in a place that, death is waiting around every corner?
Mm-hmm.
And now I look at them like there ain't nothing out there big enough to hurt us.
Right, exactly.
I mean,
right.
if all the stars are following the earth, according to Isaiah, Yeshua, Peter, and John, then clearly they're not that big.
Right. Yeah, certainly. And I agree with you as far as, examining and looking into all of that and coming to understand as far as the Book of Enoch that the luminaries are angelic hosts, and also the luminaries that they are not in any way earth-like. There's no more really concern for all of that with regard to, what I used to think as far as the Kachina prophecies and the return of the destroyer and all these things. And even though I do think that wormwood is some kind of a something, I just don't believe in it in the way that I did previously. And how that all would play out would really, I don't know. But as far as other Earth-like objects, and especially objects bigger than the Earth, no. And, things like huge suns bigger than our sun, which is relatively small when you come to know the truth of it and how they've skewed all of that. 108 Earths side by side could fit across the diameter of the sun. I mean, all that's just completely ludicrous.
Goes out the window. We're going to break. We'll come back and talk some more when we come back.
Sounds good.
And we're back on the Revolutionary Radio Project. I am your host, Rob Skiba. For the second hour of the broadcast, I'm talking with my guest, Zen Garcia. And right before the break, we were talking about how, once you get in a hold of biblical cosmology, things like the threat of Nibiru coming and wiping everything out, just frankly goes out the window. Have you heard of the Urantia book?
I have, and I have it, and I began to read it, but I really didn't. I didn't get into it and didn't read it in full, simply because, to me, there were too many keys, important keys that were missing from it with regard to truth, and so I didn't go into it a great deal. How about yourself?
Yeah, I was back in the 90s. I got a job working as an audio technician at a fair. There's the Eastern States Exposition is a huge fair. Well, the New England states represented there, and I worked. There was a gazebo stage in this Storeton village, which was like an old colonial style village, and it had a really nice gazebo in this large field. And that was the stage where they had like kid shows, juggling acts, comedy shows and things like that. And so I was running audio for that. And this one particular year, I think it was maybe 1996, this comedy juggling unicycle act came through. And between shows, I'd hang out with the entertainers and talk with them and stuff. And anyway, me and this guy got to talking about God and spiritual things. And he says, "Have you ever heard of the Urantia book?" I said, "No." Next day, he shows up with it and gives me a copy of it. And it's like a 2,000-page book. I mean, it's a big book, and it's blue. And it was published in the early 1950s. Nobody knows, so the story goes, where it came from or who published it. The book itself claims authorship from angels. So right off the bat, I got red flags going on, And I started reading this thing, and I came to believe pretty quickly this is the most dangerous book I have ever seen, because it claims authorship by angels. It comes across as if it's validating the scriptures, but at the same time elaborates on them. And like it claims to fill in the gaps that the Bible doesn't tell you. And it goes off into, you're basically like Green Lantern world. Like there's all these universes and all these,
right.
Places, or Vanton and Nevada, not Nevada, I forget what it was. But anyway, long story short, that there's multiple realms and universes and angels and principalities ruling over them. And humanity is God's great experiment in this particular area. Well, I got an email a couple days ago by this guy who he copied the email. Wasn't addressed to me; it was sent to a pastor, and at some San Jose Bible church, and he copied me on it. And he says this letter says, addressing this pastor, says, in your video, End Times and Demons 7, Rothschild's Mandela Effect, Flat Earth, 501c3, Post-Trib, and Conspiracies, you speak about the Flat Earth like it is a sin, a very stupid belief, and which even justifies you to condescend and insult people against flat earthers in your video. First of all, I want to tell you that it is only since the month of May 2017 that I am a reader of the Bible, because I realized less than 2 months before that the Bible is a flat earth book with many verses which describe the earth not as a spinning ball, but as being flat and fixed, unmovable, with a dome which retains the water above. I was a reader of the Urantia book since 1980, and I even had quite an important website for the first French translation of the Urantia book online up to the end of March 2017, the moment I understood that the Earth is not a planet among 7 billion other inhabited planets, as the Urantia book affirms. Note that more than 1/3 of this book, 25% larger than the Bible, related to the life of Jesus as the creator son of our universe, named Nabadan, and which, when universes would be finished, there would be exactly 10 million of inhabited planets. Today, I am a Bible reader and a strong believer that the true Jesus is the Jesus described in the Word of God, the Holy Bible, with more than 100 verses which speak of the earth as being flat, fixed, unmovable, with a dome, and he goes on this whole long rant about what the Ricky is and all these Bible verses. And then he goes on to say that this guy says, I invite you to do what I had done last year, and I destroyed all my books of the Urantia book and others and deleted my website with more than 4,000 pages that I'd worked on, many years of work to form the pages for the web. He says, note that I had the only first French version, the 1961 version, on the earth of the Urantia book, and the one with Bible footnote annotations on it. So this guy put a ton of work to put 4,000 pages worth of the French Bible annotated Urantia book online and deleted all of it.
Wow, that is amazing.
Became just, you know what, the Bible's true. I'm going on,
Yes, that's awesome.
Yeah, I mean, that's, I'm sure you're getting testimonies like this too, but I mean, these are the kind of testimonies that come in all the time. And so I posted something the other day about other researchers like David Flynn, who I think was a genius. I really do. And I've got his books, and it's the guy was a genius, and he was looking at information and he extrapolates all kinds of amazing things from it. But what I came to realize, I'm like, yes, the guy was a genius, but the information that he was basing his theories on was given to him by Freemasons, Illuminati, Luciferians, Satanists, occultists, Freemasons, Nazis, and atheists.
Yes.
I.e. NASA. So here, and all of us did the same thing. We had information given to us by these people, Face on Mars, the Cydonia region, all that kind of stuff. That's all given to, none of us have been there. None of us have satellites, So the information we have is given to us by NASA. And if you trust that as valid information, then you run with it and you come up with the works of David Flynn. Right. But you have like Timothy Alberino, Steve Quayle, Tom Horn, all these other guys that are like, Flat Earth would invalidate everything David Flynn wrote. Right, I'm like, so? He didn't write scripture, and as godly a man as I think he was, and as much of a genius as he was basing his theories on faulty information given to us by Luciferians. Right. So I'm not worried about 2022.
Yeah, neither am I. I had just recently, we had a meeting here where some of my listeners get together with me, and I answer questions while we have lunch with them, and we go to one of my friend, Pastor Kevin. He's got an outdoor church. It's really, really cool out in the woods, and we gather together there for church, and then we go for lunch. But a question came up this past Sunday, and they were asking me about David Flynn's work, and also, the stance of Steve Quayle and Timothy Alberino and all them, because I used to do shows with Timothy until I guess he found out I was a flat earther, and
Yeah.
and
Now you're a
basically wouldn't.
heretic.
Yeah, exactly. But and so the person had asked me what I thought about David Flynn's work and everything, and I told him, I've read Sidonia and his works that are based on, as far as the constellations and alignments to them and everything. And I said it would be really intriguing to me to see, because, as far as the zodiac and the movements of the constellations, it works and aligns better, in my opinion, to the circle of the Earth and the vaulted dome encasing and encompassing and covering over than it would a spinning heliocentric, because the stars could never stay the same in a world where the Earth is spinning around the sun spinning around the center of the Milky Way spinning around the center of some universal galactic center. I mean, the
Yeah.
stars could never remain constant in the way they have for thousands of years. And so if somebody applied and examined his work and aligned it or figured it out according to the way, the true nature as far as the biblical cosmology, I bet that there would be some parallels and some connections, and that it might even be more worthy of, brilliance and understanding if we were able to connect it to what is the true cosmology, because he didn't know that he was indoctrinated and brainwashed. I mean,
Yeah.
this was,
None of us did.
yeah, none of us did. And this was really before his time when all of this information came forth. And so if he lived long enough, I bet, like this guy with the Urantia, he would have considered, just like, I did with regard to, okay, I'm going to open myself to this possibility now that I know that the Earth is not moving, especially faster than the speed of sound or a bullet shot from the gun, and that, that there's no measurable curvature. Let me take this information and revisit the book on the courses of the heavenly luminaries and
Hmm.
see if I can make sense of that information. And doing that, I think that David Flynn would have been open-minded enough to reconsider, open himself to the possibilities, and at least study it to see if it's true or not. Not just, oh, I'm going to throw it out because it goes against everything that I've done in my lifetime's work. Just, like this guy with the Urantia, he learned the truth, and then, I mean, to take down 4,000 pages of work that you've done, that's like a lifetime,
That's huge.
huge. And I'm sure that, for that a lot of people really appreciated and supported him, and probably, even monetarily uh, gave and donated to him for those efforts. And so that was kind of maybe even like a livelihood. And for somebody to just delete all that, it really shows the power of truth. And that's the way truth, when you learn truth, it's paradigm shifting, especially this, and you have to accept it and move on and incorporate it into your life. I know personally that before 2015, when I came to the truth of this, I certainly incorporated heliocentrism and
Hmm.
Copernican, the model of the universe, into my works, and wrote about even the Anunnaki and how, they're from Nibiru and all that, and how the destroyer, even with um, the prophecies of the Kachina,
Oh
um,
yeah, especially back in
yeah, the Hopi
2012.
prophecies.
Yeah,
Yeah,
when December 21st, 2012 was, we were all jumping on all of that stuff.
right, right. And so I have had to reconsider a lot of my work, and have had to, republish certain things, and admit that I was wrong on certain things. But, I'm not going to just not incorporate truth and not open myself to examining something without preconceived notions, especially now that I know that, because anybody that examines it with open mind, it's easy to determine, and anybody can do this, that there's no curvature, and that you can see things outside of what should be possible according to the whole formula for determining and measuring that curvature. And so no matter what you think about the shape of the earth, certainly the Earth is not spinning around the sun, and it's not, as far as it's not moving, and there's no measurable curvature. So you really have to consider and take those two things into account, and then reassess everything from there. And
Oh
so,
yeah. I
yeah.
mean everything. I just I don't know if you knew I had these Torah study workbooks that I published a while back. I have a book for each of the 5 books of
Mhm.
Moses,
Yeah.
and what it is it's the traditional weekly readings where at some point in the past people divided the Torah up into weekly readings where you go through a whole thing in a year. And then when the prophets were written, they started incorporating portions from the prophets to go with the Torah portion. And then when the New Testament was written, they started pairing up New Testament portions that go with the prophet portions that go with the Torah. So I just compiled all of those into workbooks with plenty of space for you to take notes. Well, I got this idea just recently of, okay, those are great workbooks, but I think I'm going to, because I wrote an introduction at the beginning of each book. And I thought, you know what, I'm going to just take each of those introductions and make that a book. And instead of having 5 workbooks you carry around, put it all into one book. And I won't put the scriptures. I'll just put the scripture addresses so people can use their own translation, because I use the King James
Uh-huh.
in the other workbooks. And when I started doing that, I realized, I didn't really write much of an intro to Genesis. The intro that I put in the Genesis workbook was more like, hey, this is why, the Torah is cool and why I'm studying it. It wasn't really a commentary so much on Genesis as it was just an overview. So I thought, well, I think I should write one.
Yeah.
And as I did, I mean, you start with Genesis 1, man. I mean,
Right.
like, you're like, oh boy, how do I write a commentary on Genesis without dealing with this? I'm like, okay, I'm just going to dive in. So I did. And, I'm at like 65 pages of an intro right now for this. And, I'm only in like the first chapter. And what occurred to me as I was writing it, I started getting like, just like sick to my stomach, depressed, like, oh man, I know that this is not going to go well, and, but I kept hearing in my spirit, like God saying, look, that's what I wrote, you know?
Mhm.
And so I kept going, and I realized that there's a reason Genesis 1 through 11 is, I put at the beginning of the introduction, I said, no other book that I'm aware of has come under attack like the book of Genesis has.
Right.
And specifically Genesis 1 through 11. I mean, you start with the creation, and everything about what we're taught in school is 180 degrees contrary to what Genesis 1 describes. Then you get into Genesis 2, you got Adam and Eve, you got the Garden of Eden, you got original sin, and the whole reason why we needed a Messiah in the first place, and then Genesis 6, oh boy, you got angels coming down with women, and then, the flood, and then Genesis 11, this dude rises up to create a one world government, and his goal is to kill God and builds his tower. And then all the nations are separated by languages, from that point. It's like, that is, in classic storytelling, that is act 1.
Right.
You set the stage, the characters, and then something happens that sends everybody on a different path than they were on previously. And then you have the long act 2, which ends in a crisis, Battle of Armageddon, that resolves in act 3, the resolution. I'm going, okay, so if you can attack act 1, there's no sense in reading the rest of the story.
Right. Right.
I mean, you might as well just toss the book out.
Absolutely.
And man, I have struggled writing this introduction, and I'm like, I'm back almost to the struggle that I had in 2015, where it's like, okay, God, if this stuff isn't true, there's no sense in me reading Genesis 12. Who cares about Abraham?
Right.
And the promise you made to him, if the first 11 chapters are garbage.
Yes.
And I just have to, again, reaffirm to myself, it's true. It's got to be true.
Right. Yeah, without a doubt. And, that is exactly Satan's strategy with regard to having the Copernican heliocentric ever-expanding model and all of the stars being suns with possible planetary systems, and, peopled, could be millions of years, billions of years, whatever, before the, man or life evolved somehow here randomly on the earth. All of that is parcel to bringing forth and destroying Genesis 1. Because if you can do that, well, then you can throw doubt into everything else that God covenant with Abraham, the Israel, and also with the followers, the sheep that hear his voice. Even the story of Yeshua coming, being born of a virgin and defeating death and ascending to the right hand of the Father, the resurrection, all of that. You throw doubt into Genesis 1, you throw doubt into everything. And that's why, for me, after writing to revisit of creation, is that the earth was already present. The earth and the heavens are present, and then we have the firmament being fitted to the circle of the earth on the second day. Then the dry land is elevated above sea level on the third day, and then on the fourth day the luminaries are created down as many stories side by side, broken down with every day of the creation week, and then revisited and allowed them to speak for themselves so that people could get the full details of everything that was brought forth, even in the book of Jasher, the book of the Secrets of Enoch, Flavius Josephus, filling in all of the different, as far as the narrative and the pieces that remain ambiguous from just reading one account. It's without a doubt that the firmament is a solid structure.
Absolutely. I had a
Absolutely.
conversation with a friend of mine. He grew up in Greece, speaks Greek fluently.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's my go-to guy whenever I want to, have him look at something in the New Testament Greek or in the Septuagint.
Yes.
And he has no dog in the hunt. Most of the time he has no idea why I'm even asking the question,
Right.
So I had him just last night, as a matter of fact, you'll appreciate this. I had him look at Amos 9:6.
Right. Yeah.
I said, dude, check this out in Greek for me. What's going on there? And I don't think he'd ever even read that scripture before. And so he just opened it up and, I didn't say anything. I said, can you, look at your Greek Bible and read it for me? And I'm paraphrasing because I don't remember exactly how it was worded, but he basically said, he has established his dome on the earth as the support for the heavens above.
Awesome.
and he's just kind of reading it. And so today he goes like, dude, text me all the scriptures that deal with the firmament. I want to really look at this. And I said, okay, yeah, in Genesis 1, what's the word there? He goes, that's a stereoma. And he goes, oh yeah, man. I mean, that's the word that you would use for it's hard, it's firm, it's solid, it's a foundation. It's like creating the foundation that you would build your house upon. It's, everything about it was firm, hard, solid, strong.
Yes.
In no way, shape, or form can it be used for expanse. Yes, if you want to talk about an expansive, hard structure, but not as in air, vacuum, gas.
Right. Exactly. Yes.
No way.
Right. Yeah, that was my conclusion as well, looking at the word stereoma and rakia. Without a doubt, they are affirming the the firmament as being a solid, hammered out, vaulted dome type structure. And so, yeah, when you examine it, and even watching the ancients believe, they affirm it in the same manner. And so there's no question that what we consider to be just a full-on, ever-expanding universe that has no boundary between the vacuum, so-called vacuum of space, and the atmosphere, and how we even maintain an atmosphere when, the vacuum just sucks out all the air. That just would be ridiculous in and of itself. But
it's astounding that we ever
believe.
I mean, it's so simple. It's like we all refer to it as the vacuum of space,
right?
And yet air somehow is Velcroed to the earth. I mean, nature abhors a vacuum, right? I mean, that can't be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, fully. And then the whole things with, the people down in the southern hemisphere being upside down, and that somehow gravity is gluing the oceans of the world to the surface of the earth in a spherical form, when all logic and even the properties of water themselves dictate that water can only be pooled and gathered and collected when it's contained within a basin. And when it is contained in a basin and collected in such manner, it will always level off, which is why we have sea level to begin with, and that all the dry land that we have in the world holding all of those millions of pounds of water to the ball earth at the same time, and will allow a butterfly to fly freely, what is held down and what isn't. I mean, all that is just lunacy.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to break, and we'll come back and pick up where we left off in just a few minutes. Stand by.
All right.
And we're back on the Revolutionary Radio Project. I'm your host, Rob Skiba, for the final half-hour segment of the broadcast. I'm talking with my guest, Zen Garcia. Right before the break, we were discussing the properties of water and the nature of the earth and all of that. And actually, that was the issue of the oceans and stuff was the first question really kind of posed to me by John Gabrielson, actually, before I even watched Mark Sargent's Flat Earth Clues or heard or even knew that Mark Sargent existed. My friend John he lives in Austin. He came up to Dallas and was in town and said, hey, let's go out to dinner. So, okay, we met. And during the conversation, he goes, hey, Rob, you ever think of, like, how does water bend?
Right.
I'm like, what are you talking about? What do you mean? Water doesn't bend. He goes, well, like the ocean. I'm like, what are you talking about? He said, well, the Earth's 25,000 miles circumference ball, right? Yeah. Well, that the math is 8 inches per mile squared. So, like, how is the ocean, the Pacific Ocean, for example, bending 8 inches per mile squared? I'm like, what are you talking about? He's like, well, it has to bend and be a globe, right? I'm like, well,
Right.
gravity. And then, so, like, oh my God, that's your programmed response, right?
Right.
And that stupid question, man, it's like the movie Inception, right? It just stuck in my head, and I'm like, okay. And I'm thinking about it at home. Well, wait a minute. Water is like, what is it? Something like 8 pounds per, what is the 5 pounds per gallon or something, like 8 pounds. I think it's 8 pounds per gallon or something like that. Water weighs.
Uh-huh.
And the only reason I was thinking about that is because I had a job at one time filling vending machines, and people who had those like 5-gallon water jugs, replacing them.
Right.
And so I remember pretty vividly carrying these 5-gallon jugs upstairs, and
Yeah, they're heavy.
it's 40 something pounds of water. Water's heavy, and when you think about that and the weight of the ocean, I'm going, well, that would mean that gravity pulls harder on the deeper part. It's got to pull the curve. The Marianas Trench, for example, it has to pull really hard for all of that weight of water to bend, but it has to pull really lightly for 6 inches of water. At the shallow end, right? I'm going, well, that means gravity's like choosing how to pull. And, I'm out for a jog. This is all in the very beginning of all of this. Where you finally start thinking, right? I'm going, okay, it's pulling all that water, but how is that leaf, that little flower just kind of hanging over the edge of the concrete there and not being pulled down? And how is that bee flying? And what the heck, man?
Right. Yes.
Your mind starts going, whoa, I can't handle this.
Right. Yeah, that was when I came to that realization as well, too, that how does gravity just selectively choose what to adhere to the Earth and what not. And so, yeah, all that does not make any kind of sense. And so then again, reconsidering that there's no measurable curvature, that you can see monuments, lighthouses, islands, and cityscapes in excess of what is supposed to be possible according to the supposed measure and rate of the curvature of the Earth. All those things force you to reassess. And I mean, it doesn't even take long at all, which is why I know that people like, all the Skywatch people that make fun of flat earthers and other individuals, they haven't really examined the issue in the least bit,
No.
because it doesn't take long at all to realize that there's many fallacies and a lot totally, and it's lies heaped upon lies and heaped upon lies, and it's easy to realize that the structure of the Copernican heliocentric model is based upon lies and can't be affirmed as truth. And that really, when you begin to examine closely and with open-mindedness, and so having those considerations and really considering them for the first time, you quickly change your stance with regard as to what you believe.
Yeah, if you take the time, as you
Absolutely.
said, to actually think about it. Like we must be reaching some sort of critical mass right now, because I don't know if you noticed it, but like in the last month, several news outlets and science outlets and talk shows and stuff have put out videos. This is why we know the Earth's a globe. Like, and this one, there was, I forget the name of it, but it's one of those shareable videos everybody's passing all over, it's going viral. And it's this female, very condescending female. This is, guys, we know it's blah, blah, blah. And like the proofs that they're putting up there, I put something on my Facebook. I said, you know what? Globe earthers are the reason I'm a flat earther, because the arguments are so bad.
Right.
That, and again, it shows that they have done zero research, because they always have time zones prove we're on a spinning ball, like as if that couldn't happen any other way. Seasons prove it, like that couldn't happen any other way. And then the worst one was at the end of the video. She's like, and then whatever year it was, Felix Baumgartner or whatever did the, at the edge of space jump, and it shows the typical picture we've all seen with Felix standing in the doorway of the capsule and about to jump out with the curve of planet New Mexico behind him. And she draws a line across, and see, it's curved. Like, I'm like, you are such a brain dead moron that, I mean, there's another meme out there where somebody's like, just complete the curve, where they put the rest of the globe to show the same curvature, like the curvature in the Felix picture. They just keep it going for the whole globe, which means Felix is like the size of the moon. They don't think, and that's what, early, like I'm talking like the first week of my investigation, is guys started looking at videos like the 10 reasons why we know the Earth's a globe, and immediately could obliterate 8 of the 10 as not a valid argument. And I'm going, man, I know I never did, and most of the people, like you mentioned a minute ago, they just are. All of us had the same reflex. This is stupid. This is ridiculous. I'm not even gonna look into it. Why would I look at it? It's so stupid. So they don't, and then they just parrot each other with the same. Immediately when somebody has done zero research, because they all parrot the exact same programmed responses, without looking into it.
Yep. And then I have friends that are PhD scientists in whatever particular specialty, and they believe or they've had somebody that God has taken them outside of their body and they've gone into space and they've seen it and they know without a doubt it's a ball, and all of these things as well, or everything's based on spherical trigonometry when it's completely not. But again, they think they know different and better, and because of their professional opinions, they refuse to examine it with open mind. And because of that, they will never come to the truth because they've already formulated opinion. And we did too. I mean, all of us, it was difficult
Hmm.
for us to initially come to examine it with open mind. But at least when I look into an issue, I suspend my belief and I examine it from both sides until I can form my own, come to an
Informed
informed
opinion.
opinion. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
so
then
you just
decide.
nailed it. The examining both sides.
Right.
That, and I'm just as guilty, but I try not to be guilty of this, though. I really do. And that's one of the reasons why I love having you on, because there's a lot of stuff that you challenge me on that, like with Serpent Seed. I was so hardcore against it, but
Yeah.
I had never really looked into it.
Right.
And after I looked, and frankly, I don't know where I am on it at the moment, but I can tell
Uh-huh.
you this. I do know for a fact that, like we talked about in an earlier segment, the ancients believed it. The Hebrew
Right.
commentators believed it. The
Right.
Jewish rabbis believed it. I mean,
Without a doubt.
you can't argue with that. When you actually take the time to look into the other side, you realize, there's a significant, same thing with pre-trib, post-trib rapture, all of that kind of stuff. I'm at the point now where, the more I learn, the more I realize I don't have a clue.
Yeah,
And
that's true.
I'm like, okay, let's just kind of scrap everything and start over
Right, right, right.
across the board.
Yes.
Somebody asked the question earlier, and I wrote it down. I didn't want to forget before we run out of time here. I think the Gospel of Nicodemus is also known by a different title, isn't it?
Um, well, depends on which portion. There's the part about the descent of Christ into Sheol that is known by that as well, the descent of Christ into Sheol. But there are different portions. But yeah, it is called the Gospel of Nicodemus. There's another parallel account called the Gospel of Bartholomew, which also covers and shares commentary about Christ's descent into hell as well. Then the Gospel of Gamaliel, which Gamaliel was his brother, the story of the descent of Christ into Sheol. And so there's different parallel accounts and different, as far as the different apostles that they are ascribed to, but stories.
Have you heard of it's ARCHKO, the Archko volume, or the Archaeological Writings of the Sanhedrin and Talmud of the Jews? Fascinating read. A friend of mine gave it to me a while back, and that's what I was first introduced to the whole Gospel of Nicodemus thing. But it goes into like tremendous detail about what happened with Pilate and what happened
Yes.
with Herod after the events of the crucifixion.
Uh-huh.
I'd have to go back and read it again, but it was quite extraordinary because we know that Yeshua stuck around for another 40 days after he rose, right?
Right, right.
And, we don't get much information in the Gospels as to what he did or, in that time period.
Right.
But like this document actually talks about this. And if I remember right, there was an account where Jesus actually appeared to Pilate, and the whole dialogue
Right.
that happened there, I'm like, whoa, that's just, wow. I don't know, man.
Right. Yeah, the
But
Gospel of Gamaliel covers that in great detail as well.
covers that too.
Hmm.
I wonder if I'd have to go back and look at this book again. It may be just that the Archcove volume is a compilation of these other ones that you're talking about, just kind of all put in under one cover. But from what I understand, Mel Gibson's planning to do a sequel to The Passion of the Christ, and it's going to deal
Really?
with this. Yeah, there's quite a bit of stuff. You could go online and check it out on YouTube and stuff. He and Jim Caviezel is reprising his role, but they're going to show the descent of Christ.
Wow. Wow. That's going to be very interesting because nobody
Nobody's
covers
ever done
that story. Yeah, nobody talks about that. I mean, most people don't even know the fullness of that story because it's excluded from most texts, but that is fascinating. And yeah, as far as the Gospel of Gamaliel, the full title is the Lament of the Virgin and also the Martyrdom of Pilate. And so it goes to the whole story of how, his wife had the dream and warned him to not, did become a believer. Him and his wife became a believer, and they were persecuted by the Jews. It also talks about how he went to his grave because there was a prophecy. Everybody knew that Yeshua was going to go. He and some of the Roman centurions, which I believe could have been Longinus, but went there to the grave on the third day, and the Jews went there too. And when he was resurrected, he got the full story from the soldiers that were there, but the Jews had the Sanhedrin or the Pharisees, they were trying to hide. They paid off the Roman soldiers, and they went there. Claimed that the robber that had died with him, the one that was on the left hand, that Pontius Pilate knew that there was a prophecy that Yeshua was wrapped in, and placed him upon this thief that they said was Yeshua, and then he was resurrected, and then he told they knew there were prophecies of that he would be resurrected, and they knew that, and they were awaiting it, and they were watching for it, and so they tried to hide all that as well. And it's a fascinating story. And then I told you about the two children of Simeon, but that is any idea on the timeline as far as when
Yeah,
that
it's from what I understand, it's in pre-production now.
Wow,
They're
that
working
is
on.
awesome.
Yeah, if you just go on YouTube, you could find lots of interviews where he's starting to make the speaking circuit, talking about it.
Cool.
And I don't know if they're going to use the script or not. There's a guy named David Wood who was thinking he might become an executive producer for Seed with me.
Awesome.
As a believer. I've had some good interaction with him. I don't know where he is now. We haven't really talked in a few years since I went into Flat Earth research, but he was working on the resurrection of Jesus Christ was the title. And he showed me a working draft of the script and he was working with Mel Gibson and what's the other guy? Steve McAvity, I think, is the producer that is always working with Mel Gibson, like on The Patriot and Braveheart and We Were Soldiers and stuff. And I just the little bit of the script that I looked at actually did depict him going down and dealing with the Watchers and Tartarus and all kinds of stuff. But the challenge is, how do you depict all this without it, being kind of cheesy? And I think if anybody can do it, it would be them.
Right.
I mean, they would have the ability to do it. But it's going to be one of those. If you thought there was controversy on the Passion of the Christ,
right,
this one is probably going to have a lot of controversy around it. But it's there. And actually, it was Patrick Heron. His book, The Nephilim and the Pyramid of the Apocalypse, he did a whole section in that book talking about Yeshua's descent and what that was all about. And I was like, wow, that's just...
right.
Because it says in King James, and he preached to those in prison. When we hear that, we think of, okay, set up a pulpit and started, preaching, that's sort of our mindset. But actually the word there is, I think it was caruso or something like that in Greek. And the actual meaning of the word is heralded in victory. That,
awesome.
It was like, okay, Genesis 6 was all about trying to prevent the seed line that would crush the devil's head.
Right.
And the same ones that hatched that plan to try to prevent him, the seed of the woman, from existing in the first place, were bound and judged in Tartarus, and their plan had failed. And he was down there going, aha, you guys lose, I win, takes the keys, and he's out. If all of that, if they really go that route, I mean, it can be hugely powerful if it's done right.
No doubt. It would be awesome, especially if they included the fullness of the story of his resurrection and how he did descend, because that was one of the most ancient prophecies that was given to Adam and Eve, even when they were banished from paradise. Mm-hmm. He told them that it would be him that descended into Sheol and freed them from the bondage of it. Because before then, like when people die now, supposedly they go on, according to their actions, to either paradise or Sheol. But before then, everybody went to Sheol. Adam to even in Sheol. So everybody was there. And they told in the story, the Gospel of Nicodemus as far as descent, when they told him even long ago about how Yeshua, as the Word, told him when he was banishing him from paradise that I would be born of your bloodline, and it would be when I die on the cross, I will actually then come and save you, and it will be story. And it's again, it's that covenant, it's an amazing prophecy, and it being fulfilled. It also shows that resurrection and salvation, and that he could extend that.
How true these other ancient extra biblical texts are, who's to say? I mean, there certainly are things you could point to and say, well, that's a contradiction of this, that, and the other thing. But for me, what it has done for me, and I think that was the intent of these things anyway, especially the texts that were written in the first 2 centuries or so after Christ, was to just create word pictures and things that would help us to better understand the events that are in the canonized text. And when I read the lost books of the Bible, specifically the aftermath of the garden, being Adam and Eve being kicked out of the Garden of Eden, who's to say if that's really true or not? But the events that took place just, broke my heart, because you have to imagine it had to have been something like that.
Right, absolutely.
That they went through, and it just gave me so much more appreciation. And for me, I'm a chew the meat, toss the bones kind of guy. I'm like, if it agrees with Scripture, great. I could take it as elaboration. It helps me understand Scripture. If it disagrees or contradicts, then I throw that information out.
Absolutely. Yeah, you take the foundation, and then you read in the Bible, and I always use this particular example. We have one story about the life of Christ, the teaching all of the priests therein, the rabbis therein, and they were all just blown away by his knowledge. Infancy or childhood or the lost years before he began his ministry, we know nothing about that. And yet there are literally dozens of manuscripts which are claimed to be written by James, his younger brother James, Protevangelium and also the Infancy Gospels. And who better to write those stories than his stepbrothers?
A friend of mine, we're going to run out of time here in a minute, but a friend of mine actually is crafting a whole series of dramas as James, because his whole thing, that would be cool. He's like, what would it have been like to have Jesus as your brother?
Right. Yeah.
And,
totally.
He's certainly taking creative liberties and stuff, but from what I've seen, it's a really powerful set of presentations of, what could it have been like for somebody like James, who, frankly, I don't see any indication that they believed until after, when you see what happens to your brother, he gets crucified and everything he went through, and then he comes back. Okay, you're a believer, after that. Yeah. And then you got to be thinking, wow, okay, that explains this when we were 8 years old, or that, or whatever. But yeah, man, we're out of time once again. As always, a lot of fun. Thanks for coming on again, Zen.
Always a pleasure, brother, and any time. And yeah, there's always lots to talk about. Certainly, we should do a show on all the infancy stories sometime. Cause
we could do that.
Compiled all of them together.
Definitely do that. All right, that's all the time we have for tonight. Thank you guys so much for listening to the Revolutionary Radio Project. We'll see you back next week, 11 p.m. Central Standard Time. Good night, everybody.
God bless all.